It's been over 3 years since Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite came out, and a few months more than that since Injustice 2 came out. Since then, we haven't gotten more than a few hints of a new superhero fighting game, most of them being for Injustice 3. Now, I love Injustice. It's one of my favorite video game franchises, probably my favorite fighting game franchise the more I think about it. At the same time, its developer Netherrealm has been putting out a fighting game in either the Injustice or Mortal Kombat series every 2 years like clockwork. They're always good, always the best fighting game of the year, but I'm not opposed to them doing something new. That can be a new fighting game series with all the movie licenses they've added to Mortal Kombat over the years, or a game in a different genre entirely. I'm saying that I want an Injustice 3, but I'm not itching for that to be the next game Netherrealm makes right now. I'd be just as happy to see them make something else first. Now, with Marvel vs. Capcom, I just want them to make an Ultimate Edition of Infinite that fixes its graphical stutters and adds in the goddamn X-Men. Or even better, remasters Marvel vs. Capcom 2, the best one in the series still. Unlike Injustice, Marvel vs. Capcom hasn't been that great in almost 10 years. That may sound crazy, but Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 came out in 2011. Yeah, that's almost 10 years ago. So what's my point? My point is that I think it's time for a new superhero fighting game series. One that lets NetherRealm do something new and lets Capcom get back into crossover fighting games. Capcom and Warner Brothers should team up to make a DC vs. Capcom game. Now, I first want to say that I think there's one really big reason Capcom and Warner Brothers would want to do this, and it would be to spite Marvel, aside from the money of course. Keeping themselves on top of the fighting game genre would be a bonus too. Warner Brothers is the closest thing to a direct competitor to Disney, in the same way DC is to Marvel, which only adds to the hierarchy of rivalries. The main reason they wouldn't want to do this is because they wouldn't make as much money licensing out their characters than making the game wholly themselves. But I think it's possible they would consider this out of their rivalry for their competitors, and how it would be a cheaper investment than making a whole game themselves. It's Capcom though, whose reasons to spite Marvel are not only more interesting, but all around juicier. Marvel may have a better reputation in popular culture than DC because of their movies, but they do not have a friendly reputation in the video game industry. Capcom and other developers who have tried to make games with Marvel have gone on record talking about how difficult Marvel is to work with. As reported by Source Gaming's April 6, 2018 article, Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite: What Went Wrong? Marvel vs. Capcom 3 producer Ryota Nisuma cited difficulty in dealing with Marvel's demands. Apparently, Marvel was so uptight about how their characters were portrayed, they, and I quote, meticulously stressed over Doctor Strange's hand movements. Yeah, imagine that. How pretentious can you get? These guys have been making fighting games for decades. You can let them do their job to make a good game. Warner Brothers and DC, on the other hand, let NetherRealm make Superman evil. Marvel's so up his own butt, they couldn't trust Capcom to animate hands properly. That's just one thing Marvel did to make life hard for Capcom's development team. During the development of Marvel vs. Capcom 3, Marvel also refused to allow popular characters like the Juggernaut to be added because they weren't being pushed by Marvel itself at the time. They made Capcom fight to include fan favorites like Deadpool and X-23. They almost weren't in the game because Marvel didn't have enough corporate synergy around the characters. This is the big problem with working with Marvel. They, at least when it comes to fighting games, don't respect video games. They treated the Marvel vs. Capcom games like a promotional tool to the detriment of the product, and if you think they only did it once, you're wrong. This is the reason there are no X-Men, the fan favorites of the fighting game series, in Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. Marvel forced Capcom to make what was a celebration of Marvel into nothing more than a character commercial for the MCU. What we got was this bad single-player story with a boring and small character list full of only MCU characters and Spider-Man. Capcom ended up putting their reputation and finances on the line because Marvel was so difficult to work with, leaving producers to give stupid reasons as to why the X-Men weren't in the game. If you followed MVC Infinite up to its release, you probably heard about Capcom's Peter Rosas, I hope I said that right, apologies if I didn't, but he said, if you were to actually think about it, these characters are just functions. He implied that people like how Storm plays, not Storm, the character herself, which is trash. That's crap. That's not true. And well, guess what? Because of that bad publicity, plus a boring and stale roster, Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite at the time of writing, as reported by Event Hub's Steven Chavez November 11th, 2020 article, has only sold 1.6 million copies. In 3 years, a beloved fighting game franchise hasn't even sold 2 million copies with its most recent entry? I don't blame Capcom for not trying to make another Marvel vs. Capcom game. To have to deal with Marvel's crap and only sell 2 million copies, I'd say screw it too. That's where DC comes in. Now, DC, Or more so, Warner Brothers honestly doesn't seem to have a problem with letting a video game developer do what they want with their characters. They actually, trust video game developers to do their job. I mean, like I said before, they let Netherrealm make Superman and half of their heroes evil. They also let Rocksteady kill off Batman. Batman's not in their Suicide Squad game because he died. They clearly don't give a crap as long as the game is good. So Capcom, for the sake of their sanity, shouldn't have the same problems with Warner Brothers and DC as they did Marvel. Then there's the money factor. In the movies, Marvel may be the moneymaker, but in video games and most other avenues, DC reigns supreme. Outside of Spider-Man PS4, Marvel games do not do as well as DC games. Marvel's Avengers is sputtering out of the gate as people are ravenous for the multiplayer-centric Gotham Knights and Suicide Squad kills the Justice League. Has anyone even heard of how Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3 has done? I haven't. And Injustice 3 is sold more than twice what MVC Infinite did when they came out in the same year. Even the Telltale Guardians of the Galaxy game sputtered into irrelevance, while their Batman series got a second season. Marvel may have a head start on DC with this new generation Spider-Man Miles Morales, but this game can only hopefully be the start of a line of hits from them. This past generation, it's only been Spider-Man PS4 that's been an undisputed hit. They haven't earned people's faith like DC. DC's worst failure is the PC port of Arkham Knight. Other than that, it's been hit after hit. Even the most criticized game in the Arkham trilogy has a better critical reception than Marvel's best outing, which is kind of funny to think about. So Capcom can rest easy knowing that DC has a good track record with video games, and should sell. Not to mention, characters like DC's Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, and Harley Quinn can more than stand up to the most popular of Marvel's characters in popularity. And through Injustice 2, DC has shown they have no problem letting in weird picks. DC's roster is more than enough to replace the Marvel part of Capcom's crossover games. And for those who think this is still impossible, know this. Games Radar's Kai Del Mar in his November 2020 article reported about a former Capcom artist detailing a potential DC fighting game. This means Warner Brothers was at one point open to letting another publisher work with their characters, specifically Capcom themselves. While this was in the 90s, and many things have definitely changed since then, it's been like 20-30 years almost, this means there is some hope. What kept that game from being made was actually reservations on Capcom's part, not Warner Brothers or DC's, and the fact that working with Marvel was financially worth the headache at the time. Several in Capcom, alongside the artists, felt that the game wouldn't be viable because, and I quote, "The power gap between DC's characters is wider than Marvel's. And secondly, aside from Batman, DC was floundering." Again, this was the 90s. DC isn't floundering anymore now that it's owned by Warner Brothers, who's also owned by AT&T. Not to mention, their moves are doing well again. Their other games are doing well too, and they're dominating TV. If there's still any worry about the power gap between characters being an issue, they can look to how Injustice worked around it, i.e. they ignored it because people don't care. They just want to play the game. Sure, some people will complain about how Green Arrow can shoot an arrow at Superman, but just as many people notably and probably said the same thing about Resident Evil's Chris Redfield somehow taking on the Hulk. Ultimately, it doesn't matter, and Capcom's previous worries are no longer a concern. So a DC vs. Capcom game is viable, worthwhile, and a good idea, assuming Netherrealm isn't actually making an Injustice 3, because then I guess if they were, it would kind of be weird to have two DC fighting games. But if they're not, I for one wouldn't mind getting a break from Injustice to get a DC vs. Capcom game that plays just like Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite should have. What match would you like to see if this game ever came about? Batman vs. Albert Wesker? Wonder Woman vs. Morrigan? Maybe Catwoman and Felicia have a cat fight. Okay, that was a bad joke. I apologize. But I, for one, think it would be funny to see Chris Redfield punch Superman like he does boulders. Okay, that was like a really in Resident Evil joke that most people aren't probably going to get, but here's hoping that enough people do. So, as always, like and subscribe, check out the channel's Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook page. I'll leave the links to my sources below and tell me what you think.